My name is Thomas. I'm 68 years old, and until 2 months ago, I thought the biggest regret of my life was waiting 20 years to knock on my son's front door. I was wrong. The biggest regret wasn't waiting, it was realizing that while I was counting the years we'd lost, my son had built an entire family, and never once told them I existed. I found that out from a little boy holding a soccer ball. I remember every detail about that morning because my mind has replayed it 1,000 times since. The blue shutters on the house, a bicycle lying on its side in the driveway, the smell of freshly cut grass, even the knot in my stomach as I walked up the front steps with my hands shoved into my jacket pockets. For weeks I'd practiced what I wanted to say to David. I'm sorry. I should have called sooner. Can we start over? Every version sounded awkward. Nothing seemed big enough to cover 20 years of silence. Still, I convinced myself that showing up was better than doing nothing. I rang the doorbell. A few seconds later, the front door opened. A boy, maybe 10 years old, stood there looking up at me. He had dark hair. The same dark hair David had when he was that age. For a second, I forgot every speech I'd practiced. I just stared at him. He tilted his head. Can I help you? His voice snapped me back to reality. Hi, buddy, I smiled. Is your dad home? Who's my dad? David. His face brightened. Oh, he nodded. Yeah, that's my dad. I couldn't help smiling wider. So I found the right house, I guess. He looked at me curiously. Who are you? That should have been the easiest question in the world. Instead, I hesitated. It suddenly felt strange introducing myself to a child I'd never met. My name's Thomas. He waited. It was obvious he expected more. I laughed quietly. I'm your dad's father. I expected confusion. Maybe excitement. Lift. Studies and signs. Interpreting. I laughed quietly. I'm your dad's father. I expected confusion. Maybe excitement. Lift. Maybe he'd run inside yelling that Grandpa was here. Instead, he frowned. My dad doesn't have a dad. For a second, I honestly thought I'd misheard him. I'm sorry? He shrugged like he was explaining something obvious. My dad doesn't have one. There wasn't any anger in his voice, no suspicion, just absolute certainty, the kind only children have. I looked past him into the house, expecting David to appear and clear everything up. Instead, a little girl wandered into the hallway carrying a stuffed rabbit. She couldn't have been older than 7. She looked at me, then at the boy. Who's that? The boy answered before I could. He says he's Dad's dad. She blinked twice, then looked at me with complete confusion. But Dad doesn't have a dad. The words landed even harder the second time. My throat suddenly felt dry. I managed a weak smile. Is your dad home? Before either child could answer, I heard footsteps, heavy footsteps, and adults. David stepped into the hallway. For a split second, neither of us moved. 20 years disappeared. He looked older than the last time I'd seen him. More gray around his temples, broader shoulders, lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before. But he was still my son. His eyes locked onto mine. The color drained from his face. Not because he was happy, not because he was angry, because he looked completely unprepared to see me standing on his front porch. Dad? The little boy asked. You know him? David didn't answer. His wife appeared behind him a moment later. She looked from me to David, clearly realizing something was very wrong. Finally, David spoke, not to me, to the kids. Go upstairs. Dad, now. Neither child argued. They exchanged confused looks before disappearing up the staircase. The little girl looked back at me one last time, like she was trying to figure out why a stranger had upset her father. As soon as they were gone, David stepped outside and quietly closed the front door behind him. He didn't invite me in. He didn't ask how I'd been. He didn't ask why I was there. He just stood on the porch with his arms folded. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. I had imagined this reunion hundreds of times over the years. In every version, one of us eventually found the right words. Standing there, I realized neither of us had them. I started. I know this is unexpected. David looked toward the driveway instead of at me. How did you find my address? I asked around. He nodded once. I see. Another long silence. I didn't know, I said carefully. I didn't know you had kids. He finally looked me in the eye. His expression didn't change. You weren't supposed to. That sentence hit me almost as hard as what the children had said. I wasn't supposed to? I built a life. He spoke calmly, almost too calmly, and I don't want to do this on my front porch. I only wanted to talk. I know. Another pause. But today isn't the day. I looked toward the upstairs window. They really don't know who I am. It wasn't a question. David followed my gaze for a second, then quietly said the words that would replay in my head every night afterward. No, they don't. I swallowed. Why? He closed his eyes for a moment before answering. Because I never told them. I couldn't understand it. Not completely. I understood not wanting me around. I understood refusing to speak to me. Hell, after 20 years, I could even understand slamming the door in my face. But this was different. His children hadn't simply never met me. They didn't even know I existed. I opened my mouth to ask another question. David beat me to it. You should go. David, please. There wasn't anger in his voice, just exhaustion. The kind that told me this conversation had been happening inside his head for years, only I'd arrived 20 years too late to hear the beginning of it. I stood there another few seconds, hoping he'd change his mind. He didn't. Eventually, I nodded. I'm sorry. He didn't answer. I walked back to my car. As I reached for the driver's door, I looked back at the house. The little boy was standing behind the upstairs curtain, watching me, trying to figure out who the strange old man was. I got into my car and sat there for almost 10 minutes without starting the engine. One sentence kept repeating in my head. My dad doesn't have a dad. Not, my grandpa died. Not, we don't see him anymore. Not even, I've never met him. No. The boy had spoken as if his father had never had one at all. And for the first time in my life, I found myself wondering if, somewhere along the way, I'd stopped being David's father long before he stopped being my son. I drove home without turning on the radio. Normally, I always had something playing. Baseball games, old country music, even the local news if nothing else was on. That afternoon, I wanted silence. I kept hearing that little boy's voice. My dad doesn't have a dad. Children don't invent things like that. They repeat what they've been taught, or in this case, what they'd never been told. I spent the entire drive trying to convince myself there had to be another explanation. Maybe David planned to tell them someday. Maybe they were simply too young. Maybe he'd wanted to wait until they were older. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I'd invented half a dozen excuses for him. None of them sounded believable. The house felt even emptier than usual. My wife, Linda, had passed away just over 2 months earlier after a 3-year battle with cancer. We'd lived in that house for 43 years. Every room still belonged to her. Her reading glasses were still on the kitchen counter. Her favorite coffee mug still sat beside the sink because I couldn't bring myself to put it away. People tell you grief gets easier. Maybe they're right. But nobody tells you how quiet a house becomes after the person who filled it with life is gone. I made myself a cup of coffee I didn't really want and sat at the kitchen table. Without thinking, I reached for my phone. For almost 40 years, whenever something happened, I'd call Linda. Good news, bad news, didn't matter. She was always the first person I wanted to tell. My thumb hovered over her name before I remembered. I slowly put the phone back down. I found him, I said out loud to an empty kitchen. And I think I made everything worse. That night I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those 2 children. Not because they had rejected me. They hadn't. They couldn't reject someone they'd never even known existed. That somehow hurt more. The next morning, I found myself standing in the hallway outside the spare bedroom. Linda had turned it into a storage room years ago. Every time she wanted to keep something sentimental, she'd say the same thing. Don't throw it away. Future us might want it. I'd laughed at her every single time. Now I was grateful she never listened to me. I opened the closet. Boxes were stacked from floor to ceiling. Christmas decorations, old tax records, David's school projects, photo albums, things we'd carried from one decade into the next because neither of us could bear to part with them. I pulled out the first photo album I found and carried it to the living room. Dust covered the blue fabric cover. I smiled without meaning to. Linda had labeled everything, David, ages 5 to 10. I opened it. The first few pages made me smile. David missing his 2 front teeth. David riding his first bicycle. David covered head to toe in mud after trying to help me plant tomatoes. I remembered that day. He'd insisted he was doing real work. I'd spent an hour pretending his crooked little rose actually meant something. I laughed quietly to myself. Then I turned another page. His Little League team, David standing proudly in his oversized uniform, his teammates, his coach, the parents. I wasn't in the picture. Of course, I thought. Somebody had to take it. I turned another page. Birthday party. Again, I wasn't there. Another page. School science fair. Still not there. Christmas morning. Nothing. Family vacation. Nothing. I frowned. That wasn't unusual. Parents take pictures. They don't appear in them. I kept flipping. Page after page. Birthday. Halloween. School concert. Fishing trip. Camping. Graduation from middle school. Then something strange happened. I realized I couldn't remember taking half of them. I looked closer. Some of the photos had clearly been taken from the audience, some from the sidelines, some from across the room. Different angles, different cameras. I turned to the last page. There was a small note in Linda's handwriting. Mrs. Collins took this one because Tom had to leave early for work. I stared at it. The photo showed David standing with a small baseball trophy. He couldn't have been more than 11. He was smiling, but his eyes, they weren't looking at the camera. They were looking toward the parking lot, as if he were searching for someone. I frowned. I didn't remember leaving. In fact, I was almost certain I'd stayed for that game. I closed my eyes and tried to picture it. The trophy ceremony, the parents clapping, the coach shaking hands, the drive home. Nothing. It was all blurry. I turned the picture over. Linda had written the date. For some reason, that date bothered me. I stood up and walked to the hallway closet again. There was another box labeled simply, Home Videos. I'd completely forgotten we still had them. An old VHS camcorder sat underneath. Years ago, I'd transferred most of the tapes to DVDs because Linda was afraid we'd lose them. It took me almost 20 minutes to find the right disc. When it finally loaded, the television filled with grainy footage from a Little League field. Linda was holding the camera. I could hear her laughing behind it. "There he is," she said. "Wave, David." A skinny little boy waved excitedly toward the camera. Then, he looked somewhere else, toward the parking lot. The game ended, the team lined up. Parents applauded. The coach handed out trophies. David accepted his, then immediately looked toward the entrance again. I heard Linda's voice, soft enough that she'd probably forgotten she'd even said it. "It's okay, sweetheart." He had to go back to work. David nodded. He tried to smile, but even through the grainy footage, I could tell he was disappointed. The video ended. I sat there staring at the blank television screen. I genuinely hadn't remembered leaving. In my memory, I'd been there. I'd watched the whole game. I'd congratulated him afterward. But the tape didn't lie. Neither did Linda's voice. I hadn't stayed. Work had called. And somewhere over the years, my mind had quietly rewritten the memory into something easier to live with. I suddenly wondered, how many other memories had I edited, without even realizing it? The question haunted me for days, not because I was afraid of the answer, because, for the first time in my life, I honestly didn't know what the answer was. When you're young, memories feel permanent. You assume they're carved into stone. By the time you're my age, you realize they're more like old photographs left in the sun. The edges fade. The colors change. Sometimes, without noticing, your mind paints over the parts it doesn't want to remember. For nearly 40 years, I'd told myself the same story. I wasn't an affectionate father. I knew that. But I was dependable. I worked. I paid every bill. I never missed a mortgage payment. David never wondered where his next meal was coming from. He always had shoes that fit. He went to a good school. When Linda got sick the first time, I worked overtime for almost 2 years to make sure we could afford every treatment insurance refused to cover. Whenever anyone asked what kind of father I'd been, that was the list that immediately came to mind. I'd done everything a father was supposed to do, hadn't I? That question refused to leave me alone. A few days later, I went back into the storage room, not looking for anything specific, just looking. Linda had always been the organized one. Every box had a label. Every folder had a date. She used to joke that if she ever disappeared, I'd never find anything. She was probably right. Near the back of one shelf sat a small plastic container with masking tape across the lid. In Linda's handwriting were 3 simple words: David's school stuff. I carried it into the dining room and opened it. Construction paper, report cards, certificates, Father's Day cards. Some of them still had dried macaroni glued to the front. I laughed despite myself. David had loved arts and crafts when he was little. He was terrible at it. Everything he made looked like it had survived a tornado. Linda kept every single piece anyway. I started flipping through them. 2nd grade, 3rd grade, 4th grade. Then I stopped. There was a folded sheet of notebook paper. The edges were yellow from age. Across the top, in a teacher's handwriting, were the words, "Interview one of your parents." I unfolded it carefully. Question 1. What is your parents' favorite food? David had written steak. Correct. Next question. What makes your parent laugh? Funny movies. Also true. Then, what does your parent like doing with you the most? David's answer was only 3 words. I don't know. I stared at them. Kids exaggerate. I knew that. Maybe he'd been having a bad day. Maybe he hadn't understood the assignment. I kept reading. What do you do together every weekend? He works. That one made me uncomfortable. Not because it was unfair, because I couldn't honestly say it wasn't true. Saturday mornings, I'd usually leave before breakfast. Extra shifts paid time and a half. I always told myself I was doing it for my family. Maybe I was, but that didn't change the fact that I wasn't there. Another page slipped out from underneath. This one was a permission slip. Linda had signed it. Next to her signature, she'd written a small note. Tom couldn't get off work. I'll be there instead. I found another. School concert. Same handwriting. Tom is working late again. Another. Field trip. Dad has work. Another. Parent-teacher conference. Thomas sends his apologies. I slowly leaned back in my chair. At first, I wanted to defend myself. I had responsibilities. Somebody had to pay the bills. Overtime wasn't optional half the time. If I said no too often, someone else got the hours. That's how it worked. But another thought crept in. How many times had I chosen work when I didn't actually have to? I honestly couldn't remember anymore. Linda used to ask me to come home early. Sometimes I did. A lot of times I didn't, because I figured there'd always be another baseball game, another recital, another birthday dinner. Children don't stay children forever. Nobody tells you that while you're living it. They tell you after it's too late. I kept digging through the box until I found a small spiral notebook. The cover was bent. A 5th grade notebook. Nothing special. Inside were spelling words, math homework, half-finished doodles. Then, near the back, I found a page folded in half. Across the top, in David's childish handwriting, were the words, "Things I want to tell Dad." I smiled at first. I expected something funny. Maybe a Christmas list. Instead, there were 6 short sentences. I hit my first home run today. I think Mom cried because she's worried about money. I got picked for the science team. I think Emily likes me. I wish we could go fishing again. The last sentence wasn't finished. It simply read, I don't know why. And then the pencil stopped. No period, no ending. Just blank paper underneath. I don't know if he'd been interrupted or if he decided not to finish the thought. I sat there for a long time with that notebook in my hands. Eventually, I noticed something else. Every sentence began the same way. Not, I told Dad. Not, Dad knows. Not, Dad said. They all started with I want to tell Dad. The realization hit me so quietly that it almost hurt more than if it had arrived all at once. My son hadn't grown up believing I wouldn't love him. He'd grown up believing I wasn't available. There was a difference. A painful one. One meant your father didn't care. The other meant you stopped trying to reach him because you assumed something else would always matter more. I looked toward the hallway where Linda's favorite chair still sat by the window. She'd spent years trying to protect both of us. She covered for me, made excuses, smoothed over disappointments before they became arguments. I'd always thought she was helping me. Now I wondered if she'd simply been carrying the weight I refused to notice. As I carefully placed the notebook back into the box, something slipped from between its pages and landed on the floor. It wasn't David's handwriting. It was Linda's. A single folded envelope. Across the front she'd written only one word. Thomas. I don't think I've ever opened an envelope more slowly in my life. For a long time I simply stared at my name. Linda's handwriting hadn't changed in 40 years. She always wrote in neat little cursive letters that leaned slightly to the right. Seeing them again made my chest tighten. I wasn't sure when she'd written it, or why she'd hidden it inside David's notebook instead of leaving it somewhere I'd actually find it. The envelope wasn't sealed. She'd never liked licking them. I smiled at the thought before carefully unfolding the letter. It wasn't long. Just 1 page. Thomas, if you're reading this, then one of 2 things has happened. Either I've finally convinced you to clean out the storage room, or I'm no longer here to do it myself. Knowing you, it's probably the second one. I laughed quietly. Even after all these years, she still knew exactly how stubborn I was. Then I kept reading. I'm not writing this because I think you're a bad husband or a bad man. You're neither. I'm writing this because I think you're a bad husband or a bad man. You're neither. I'm writing this because I'm afraid you'll spend the rest of your life believing you were a good father without ever asking David what he needed. My smile disappeared. You love him. I know that better than anyone. But loving someone and making sure they feel loved are two different things. I read that sentence 3 times. Not because I didn't understand it. Because I did. Maybe for the first time. Linda had spent years trying to tell me exactly that. Not by arguing. Not by accusing. Just with little comments I'd always brushed aside. Maybe stay for the whole game. He was hoping you'd come. He's been waiting to show you something. I'd always answered the same way. I'm doing this for you too. At the time, I believed it. Maybe I still did. But intentions don't change memories. The letter continued. David doesn't need more things. He doesn't need another bicycle. He doesn't need another college fund. He needs you to stop looking at your watch every time he starts talking. I closed my eyes. A memory surfaced before I could stop it. David was maybe 13. I'd been balancing the checkbook at the kitchen table after dinner. He came in carrying some kind of model airplane he'd built for school. Dad, look. I glanced up. Looks good. Then I looked back down. He didn't move. I made the wings myself. That's nice. I never actually looked. Not really. A minute later, he quietly walked back upstairs. Until that moment, I'd completely forgotten it had ever happened. How many moments like that had disappeared from my memory, while staying perfectly alive in his? I forced myself to keep reading. One day, David will stop asking you to notice him. When that day comes, don't mistake his silence for independence. It will mean he's given up hoping you'll look up. My hands began to shake. I had spent 20 years telling myself our relationship fell apart because of one argument. One terrible night. One conversation neither of us could take back. But sitting there with Linda's letter, I realized the argument hadn't destroyed our relationship. It had simply been the last brick. The wall had been built years earlier. One missed conversation at a time. One rushed answer at a time. One later after another. By the time we had that final fight, there was already too much silence between us. I turned the page over. I thought that was the end. Instead, there was one final paragraph. If you're reading this after I'm gone, please don't waste any more years. David is far more like you than either of you realizes. That means he's just as stubborn. One of you will have to be brave enough to go first. Please let it be you. I sat there for what felt like an hour. The house was completely silent. I could almost hear Linda moving around the kitchen, humming while she cooked, calling me in for dinner, complaining that I left my shoes in the hallway again. Funny how grief works. Some days you can't remember a person's voice. Other days you swear they're in the next room. Eventually I folded the letter exactly the way she'd folded it. Then I noticed something tucked into the bottom of the envelope. A small photograph. It wasn't one I'd ever seen before. David looked about 25. He was standing beside a woman I recognized from the porch. His wife. They were smiling. She was visibly pregnant. Written across the back, in Linda's handwriting, were the words, "The day they told us we were going to be grandparents." My heart stopped. Us. Linda had known. Of course she had. I suddenly remembered all those afternoons she'd said she was going shopping, or having lunch with an old friend. The little weekend trips she'd taken by herself after David stopped speaking to me. At the time, I'd never questioned them. Now the truth was staring me in the face. She'd never stopped seeing our son. She'd never stopped knowing our grandchildren. And she'd never told me. Not because she wanted to punish me. Because she'd been protecting the only relationship she still had with him. If she'd told David she was bringing me, he probably would have stopped opening the door for her too. The realization hurt. But strangely, I couldn't blame either of them. I only had one question left. If Linda had spent all those years quietly keeping one foot in both worlds, was there anyone else who knew the whole story? Someone who had watched all of this happen from the outside. Someone who could finally tell me what my own son had never been able to say. The only person I could think of was Frank. We'd lived next door to each other for almost 30 years before he and his wife moved to Florida. Frank had watched David grow up. He'd coached his Little League team for 2 seasons. He'd been at birthday parties, barbecues, school fundraisers. If anyone had seen what I'd missed, it was probably him. I found his number in an old address book Linda refused to throw away. He answered on the 3rd ring. Thomas? His voice sounded older, slower, but unmistakably frank. It's been a while. It sure has. We talked about nothing for a few minutes. His health, the weather, retirement, The kinds of conversations men have when they're avoiding the real reason someone called. Finally, I asked, "Frank, can I ask you something?" There was a long pause. "You already know the answer, don't you?" "I don't think I do." Another silence. Then he sighed. "You finally found David." It wasn't a question. I leaned back in my chair. "Linda told you?" "No. I guessed. She always hoped you'd get there." I looked toward the letter lying on the table. "So she talked to you about him?" "Sometimes. I never betrayed anyone's confidence." "I know." Frank cleared his throat. "What happened?" I told him everything. Driving to David's house. Meeting the kids. The little boy laughing. "My dad doesn't have a dad." When I finished, Frank didn't speak for several seconds. Finally, he said something I wasn't expecting. "That must have hurt." It did. I imagine it hurt David too. Those words stung. Not because they were cruel. Because they were true. "I don't understand," I admitted. "I never stopped loving that kid." "I know. So how did we end up here?" Frank laughed quietly. "You really want me to answer that?" "I wouldn't have called if I didn't." He took a deep breath. "Do you remember the championship game?" I frowned. "The one they lost?" "Yeah. I remember." "You don't." His answer caught me off guard. "I was there." "So was I." Frank let the silence sit for a second. "Do you remember what happened after the game?" I searched my memory. "They lost by 1 run. The umpire missed a call. The kids were upset. That's all I remember." Frank sighed. "David cried." I blinked. "No, he didn't." "He absolutely did." I couldn't picture it. "My son never cried over baseball." "He wasn't crying because they lost." Frank's voice became softer. "He cried because every other kid had somebody waiting for them afterward." I felt my stomach tighten. "You'd already gone back to work." I closed my eyes. Another memory I'd rewritten or erased. I don't remember that. "I know." I sat with him for about 20 minutes while Linda packed the car. He kept looking toward the parking lot. Frank paused. "You know what he asked me?" I couldn't answer. He asked if working was more important than watching him play. I felt something inside me collapse. "What did you tell him?" "The truth." "What truth?" Frank sighed again. "I said your dad works hard because he loves you." I swallowed. "And David?" He nodded. Then he asked. Frank stopped. "What?" he asked. "Then why doesn't he ever look happy when he's here?" The room suddenly felt smaller. I remembered standing on those sidelines. I remembered thinking about deadlines, invoices, overtime, the transmission on my truck, the roof that needed replacing. I had been physically present more often than I remembered, but mentally, I wasn't. Frank continued. "You know what always stood out to me?" "What?" "You never yelled." I frowned. "What?" "You weren't one of those fathers screaming from the bleachers. You weren't mean. You weren't cruel. You weren't embarrassing." I nodded slowly. "I thought that made me a good dad." "It made you a calm dad." Frank corrected me gently. But there was something missing. I already knew what he was going to say. "You celebrated achievements. You solved problems. You paid for everything. But I don't think I ever saw you just," he searched for the word, "enjoy him." That sentence hurt more than anything I'd read in Linda's letter, because I couldn't argue with it. I loved teaching David things. How to ride a bike. How to change a tire. How to throw a baseball. But once the lesson was over, I always had somewhere else to be. Something else to finish. Another responsibility waiting. I'd treated fatherhood like another job. One where success was measured by results, not by time. Frank's voice pulled me back. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "When was the last time you told David you were proud of him?" I answered immediately. "When he graduated college." Frank didn't say anything. I frowned. "What?" "Thomas. He graduated 31 years ago." The realization hit me like a punch. 31 years. Not once. Not at his wedding. Not when he bought his first house. Not when he became a father. Not once. I opened my mouth. Nothing came out. Frank spoke quietly. "I don't think David wanted a different father." I looked down at the table. "I think," he paused. "He just wanted to feel like he mattered more than whatever came next." After we hung up, I sat there staring at my phone. For the first time since I'd stood on David's porch, I stopped asking myself why he'd hidden me from his children. Instead, I started asking a much harder question. If I had spent an entire lifetime making my own son feel invisible, what reason had I ever given him to believe I'd be any different with his children? That evening just before sunset, there was a knock at my front door. I wasn't expecting anyone. When I opened it, a woman stood on my porch. I recognized her immediately. It was David's wife. She held a small envelope in one hand. Before I could say a word, she looked at me with tired eyes and quietly said, "David doesn't know I'm here." Then she held out the envelope. "I think it's time you knew the rest." I stepped aside. "You'd better come in." She hesitated before crossing the doorway. It struck me how strange the moment was. My daughter-in-law had probably been inside my house before. Linda had clearly kept in touch with them. Yet to me, she was almost a stranger. She looked around the living room for a second before her eyes settled on Linda's chair. "I miss her." It was such a simple sentence that it caught me off guard. "So do I," she nodded. "I know." Neither of us said anything for a while. Finally, she handed me the envelope. "I've wanted to give you this for a long time." I looked down at it. "What's inside?" She smiled sadly. "The answer to the question you've been asking." I opened it carefully. There was only one sheet of paper. Not a letter. A photocopy. At the top, in David's handwriting, were the words, "Things I'll never let my kids wonder about." I frowned. It looked old. Maybe written before his first child was born. The first line read, "They'll never wonder if I love them." The second, "They'll never wonder if I'm proud of them." The third, "They'll never wonder if work matters more than they do." Every sentence felt heavier than the last. Then, I reached the final one. "They'll never spend their childhood trying to earn my attention." I slowly lowered the paper. "I didn't know." She nodded. "I know. I never meant." "I know." She wasn't angry. If anything, she looked tired, like she'd had this conversation in her own head 100 times. I looked back down at the paper. "So, this is why he never told them about me." She shook her head. "No, not exactly." I looked up. "He didn't hide you because he hated you." She paused. "He hid you because he was afraid." "Afraid of what?" She took a long breath. "When Emma was born, David spent weeks talking about you." That surprised me. "He did?" "Every day. He kept asking himself whether he should call you." My chest tightened. "He wanted to." She nodded. "More than once." I couldn't speak. She continued. "Then one night, he asked me something." "What?" She looked down at her hands. "He said, if my father couldn't make time for me, what makes me think he'll make time for my daughter?" I closed my eyes. There it was. Not anger, not revenge. Fear. Pure fear. She continued quietly. "I told him people can change." He said maybe. "I told him children deserve grandparents." He agreed. "So why didn't he call?" She looked at me with tears beginning to form. "Because he wasn't afraid of you hurting him. He was afraid of watching his children wait by the window the way he used to." The room fell completely silent. I suddenly remembered something I'd buried for decades. Every Friday, when I worked late, David used to sit on the front porch. Linda once told me he liked being the first one to see my truck. I'd laughed. I'd thought it was cute. What I never realized was that some nights he waited until after dark. I rubbed my face. "I never knew." "I believe you," she answered immediately. "I honestly believe you." That almost made it worse, because if she believed I hadn't meant to hurt him, then intent really didn't matter. Only the result did. She reached into her purse again. "This one's actually from David." She handed me another envelope. Unlike Linda's, this one was sealed. "When did he write it?" "Years ago. He never sent it." I carefully opened it. The paper inside was worn from being folded. The first line nearly broke me. "Dad, I don't hate you." I stopped reading. I couldn't. After everything, that was how he'd begun. I forced myself to continue. "I keep trying to explain why I don't call anymore. People think I'm angry. I'm not. I'm tired. My vision blurred. Every time I tried to get close to you, work came first. Eventually I realized I couldn't compete with your responsibilities. So I stopped trying." There were tears on the page now. Mine. I wiped them away before they smeared the ink. The last paragraph was shorter than the rest. "If you ever wonder why my children don't know you, it's because I promised myself they'd never spend years hoping someone would become the father they needed. I couldn't ask them to take that chance." There was no signature. Just, "Dad." And then nothing. He'd never finished it. I folded the letter as carefully as I could. Neither of us spoke for a long time. Finally, I asked the only question that still mattered. "Does he know you kept this?" She nodded. "Yes. And he let you bring it?" Another nod. "He said," she smiled faintly, "that if you ever became ready to read it, then maybe he was finally ready to have the conversation." I looked at her. "You mean?" She stood. "He'll be at Emma's soccer game this Saturday." She walked toward the front door before turning back. He's not inviting you because everything is forgiven. I know. He's inviting you because Emma asked a question after you left. I felt my heart start racing. What did she ask? Her smile was small, but genuine. She asked, if that old man really is Grandpa, why did he look so sad? After she left, I sat alone in the same chair where I'd spent weeks trying to understand what I'd done wrong. For the first time, I wasn't thinking about the years I'd lost. I was thinking about Saturday. Not because I expected my son to forgive me, not because I expected to become part of his family overnight, but because, after 20 years of silence, my granddaughter had unknowingly given me something I'd almost run out of. One more chance. And this time, I wasn't going to leave early.